The last Comanche woman faced a terrible fate, until a silent rancher saved her freedom. The winter had come early that year. The air was cold and sharp, cutting through layers of clothing as though it wanted to remind everyone that life on the frontier was never gentle. In the small settlement at the edge of the plains, the townspeople moved quickly, bundled in worn coats, boots crunching over frozen ground. Yet among all of them, one figure moved differently. She did not rush. She did not fuss over the cold. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon with a quiet alertness, as if the wind itself carried warnings only she could hear. She was known to some as the last Comanche woman. Others called her by a name that sounded foreign to them, twisting it until it lost its meaning. She had been alone for months, wandering the open land, searching for safety, or perhaps for a place that no longer existed. Her people, once proud and free, had been broken by wars, diseases, and forced removals, tribes scattered, homes destroyed, and she, a woman of courage and stubbornness, had survived while most had fallen. Her strength had become her only companion. In town, people whispered about her. She won't last long out there, some said. It's too cold, too lonely. They did not know her story, and they did not care. To them, she was a problem to be solved. The authorities had plans, drawn up in ink and law books. She was to be moved, confined, or placed under someone's control. In the eyes of the law, her life was no longer her own. She had no say. And yet, she had survived this long by being careful, silent, and observant. The woman did not walk like a stranger. Every step, every glance, carried the memory of years spent surviving the wild. She had learned to read the clouds, the winds, and the tracks animals left in the snow. Every sound in the night made her pause. Every movement in the shadows earned a careful watch. She carried no weapons, but her body knew how to respond, how to flee, how to hide. Still, she avoided violence whenever possible. There had been enough bloodshed in her life, enough loss. Survival was now her only goal. On this day, she reached the outskirts of the settlement. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the smell of wood fires and baked bread. Children ran past, their cheeks red from cold, laughter spilling into the air. For a moment, she felt the pang of a life she would never have, a life filled with ordinary things, warmth, family, safety. But those were ghosts. Her reality was different. She needed shelter, yes, but she also needed to remain unseen. People could be kind, but more often they were not. Kindness could vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving her vulnerable. She found a small alley behind the general store, where crates of supplies were stacked haphazardly. The shadows there offered cover. She crouched low, her hands brushing the frozen dirt, her mind working through possibilities. She needed information. Who controlled the town? Who made the decisions? Which men carried the law on paper, and which lived by their own rules? Observation was a tool as sharp as any knife she had once carried. She watched the town's officials, noting how they spoke, who answered to whom, and the patterns of daily life. Knowledge could keep her alive longer than strength alone. At midday, the town square filled with activity. Merchants called out prices, cowboys herded supplies, and townspeople exchanged news. She stayed at the edges, a shadow among shadows, listening. Bits of conversation reached her ears. Talk of a woman who had no family, talk of legal matters, talk of an arrangement that would take someone like her out of the wild and put her into the hands of strangers. Her stomach tightened. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But knowing it was coming did not make it any easier. She had no allies here, No one would speak for her. A quiet man stood near the edge of the square, watching the crowd. He wore a coat too large for him, sleeves rolled back, boots caked in mud. Unlike others, he did not shout, did not push, did not laugh or call. He simply observed, his eyes scanning the people, the movements, the reactions. She noticed him immediately. Something about the way he carried himself made her pause. He was not one of the officials, not one of the merchants, not one of the busy townspeople. Yet he belonged, or at least he understood the town better than most. The woman considered her options. She could move again, keep walking along the outskirts, disappear into the plains where the wind and snow could hide her. That path was dangerous. Food would be scarce, and if she was caught in the cold without shelter, death would come quickly. But she also knew that stepping into the town, into the attention of authorities, carried its own dangers. Either choice was risky. Either choice demanded courage. Survival had always demanded courage. By late afternoon, officials began to gather. They spoke in low tones, arranging their plans. She could hear fragments of words: relocation, custody, responsibility. She recognized the pattern. The law would take her life in small, controlled steps. Her freedom would be signed away, paper by paper, and yet she remained unseen, crouched in the shadows, listening, learning, and calculating. She did not panic. Fear was natural, but panic could be deadly. She had learned this the hard way. As night approached, the cold deepened. People lit lanterns, casting warm circles of light on the snow. She stayed hidden, knowing the light could reveal her, yet she could see everything. The quiet man remained nearby, watching from the edges. Occasionally he glanced toward her, though she was careful to remain behind crates and shadows. There was a stillness about him that suggested patience, a strength that did not need words. She could not know his intentions, but she felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps in a place where no one spoke for her, someone might act without needing to speak. She remembered her childhood, the stories told around fires, the songs of her people, the laughter of children who would never grow up in the world she now faced. Her heart ached with loss, yet it also held determination. She had survived worse. She had walked through fire and frost, through hunger and fear. She had lost almost everyone she loved, but not her will to live. And now, in this small settlement at the edge of the plains, she faced a different test, one of law, one of human judgment, one of unseen hands deciding her fate. She could not fight all of it, but she could endure, observe, and choose when to act. The night grew colder. Snow began to fall in quiet flurries, coating the streets in white. She pulled her coat tighter, her breath forming small clouds in the air. The town went on as if unaware of her presence, and perhaps that was her advantage. To survive here, she needed invisibility, patience, and timing. She stayed until the lanterns burned low, then slipped away into the shadows, moving silently toward a hidden corner she had discovered earlier. There she could rest without drawing attention, planning her next move in the cold, quiet night. As she lay beneath a small overhang, listening to the wind through the buildings, she thought of the man she had noticed, the quiet rancher at the edge of the square. Something about him gave her pause. He had not shouted, had not demanded, had not pointed her out to the authorities. Yet he had watched. Perhaps he understood something others did not. Perhaps he would act when no one else would. She did not know. She could not trust easily, but she also knew that sometimes survival required recognizing those rare chances when fate might lean, even slightly, in one's favor. The woman closed her eyes for a few moments, letting the cold seep through her. letting the memories and the wind mix into a quiet resolve. She had survived this long by being careful, by watching, by listening, by moving when others did not. She would survive this night too, and perhaps in the coming days she would find that her life could change in ways she had never imagined. Someone might see her not as a problem, not as a statistic, but as a person. That thought, fragile as it was, gave her a small warmth against the winter's chill. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The town settled into the quiet hum of night, and somewhere in the shadows, a woman, the last of her people, waited, silent and patient, her mind alert, her heart steady. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. She would not give up her life without understanding the hands that tried to take it. And somewhere, she hoped, there was someone who might stand quietly, patiently, and change the path she had walked alone for so long. The next morning, the woman awoke to the weak light of dawn creeping over the frozen streets. The wind had died down overnight, leaving only a brittle, biting cold that made every step an effort. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, rubbing her hands together to bring some warmth back into them. The settlement was already stirring. Merchants were opening their shops, children ran past on their way to chores or errands, and men moved quickly, their faces set against the cold. She stayed in the shadows, careful not to be seen, and watched as the town went about its daily life. Her time in the settlement had taught her a few things. The townspeople were predictable. They moved according to patterns, followed routines, and trusted the rules of the town more than their own judgment. The woman had learned to use these patterns to her advantage. She could plan her movements, hide when necessary, and avoid attention. But she also knew that the law had its eyes on her. The officials would not wait forever before making their move. Every day that passed, the risk grew. She could feel it like a weight pressing on her shoulders. She walked quietly along the edge of the square, staying close to walls and crates. Her eyes scanned the people, noting the expressions, the gestures, the little details that revealed more than words ever could. She saw merchants arguing over prices, a man chasing after a runaway animal, and children laughing as they slid across the ice. She saw the officials, too, moving in groups, whispering to one another, and occasionally glancing around as if searching for someone. They were searching for her, though they did not know it yet. She remained hidden, blending into the background, silent and careful. Among the crowd, she noticed the quiet man again, the rancher. He stood apart from the others, observing rather than participating. He did not call out. He did not laugh. He did not hurry. He simply watched. She could see it in the way he held himself, the way his eyes followed the movements of the people, noting things others missed. There was patience in him, a stillness that seemed almost unnatural in a town full of noise and motion. She did not understand him, and she could not yet trust him. But there was something about him that gave her hope. Perhaps he would act differently than the others. She moved cautiously through the settlement, keeping to the edges and staying in the shadows. Every now and then she would pause and observe, learning more about the people around her. She noticed a group of officials talking near the town hall, their voices low but tense. She could hear fragments of their conversation. "We need to decide soon. She cannot remain here. Someone must take responsibility." Her stomach tightened. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But hearing it made the reality sharper. Her freedom was being discussed as if it were a commodity, something to be transferred or taken away. The woman understood the rules of this world, harsh and unkind as they were. People in authority believed in control, in order, in rules written on paper. They did not see her as a person with thoughts, feelings, or dreams. To them she was an object, a problem, a responsibility, and yet she had survived by being clever, patient, and careful. She had learned to read people as well as she read the land. She knew when someone was truthful, when someone was planning, and when someone could be persuaded. Observation was her greatest weapon. As the day wore on, the officials became more active. They began to make plans, consulting books and papers, preparing to summon witnesses and arrange for her removal. The woman listened from a safe distance, noting the names, the positions, and the attitudes of those involved. She knew that if she did not act carefully, she could be taken at any moment. Her heart raced, but her movements remained calm. Panic would be her enemy. Patience and timing would be her allies. Meanwhile, the quiet rancher continued to observe. He walked slowly through the town, stopping occasionally to watch a merchant or a child. He did not engage in conversation, but his eyes were alert, taking in every detail. The woman noticed the subtle way he moved, careful and deliberate. He seemed to understand the town in a way that went beyond mere observation. He understood the people, the routines, and perhaps even the unspoken rules that governed life here. She could not know his intentions, but she sensed that he was different. Perhaps he could make a choice that others would not. By afternoon, the tension in the town was palpable. Officials moved with purpose, speaking in hushed tones, casting occasional glances toward the outskirts. The woman stayed hidden, crouched behind crates and walls, her mind working through possibilities. She considered fleeing, moving further into the wilderness, where the wind and snow could hide her. But she knew that the plains were dangerous, especially in winter. Food would be scarce, and exposure to the cold could be deadly. Staying in the settlement was risky, but leaving carried even greater danger. She watched as the officials began to gather in a small circle, discussing her fate in whispers. "She cannot stay here," one said. "She needs to be moved. Someone must take responsibility." The woman's heart sank, but she did not show fear. She had learned long ago that fear could be exploited. She remained silent, still and patient, waiting for the right moment to act. She had survived worse than this. She could survive this, too. The rancher approached the circle quietly, his presence unnoticed by most. He did not speak, but his eyes met hers briefly across the square. There was a silent understanding, an unspoken recognition of the situation. He did not offer help immediately, did not draw attention to her, but she sensed that he was aware of her plight. The connection was brief, almost imperceptible, but it gave her a small spark of hope. Perhaps she was not entirely alone in this town after all. As evening approached, the officials grew impatient. Plans were being made, papers prepared, and arrangements considered. The woman remained hidden, her mind racing through every possibility. She had to survive the night, gather more information, and prepare for what might come next. She could not rely on luck. She could not trust anyone completely. But she could rely on her wits, her observation skills, and perhaps in some small way, the quiet man who had noticed her. Night fell and the town quieted, though the cold never let up. The woman found a hidden corner, a small overhang where she could rest without being seen. She crouched low, keeping warm with her coat and the small bundle of cloth she carried. The wind howled through the streets, carrying the smell of smoke and wood. She listened carefully, noting the sounds of the town, the patterns of movement, and the distant voices of officials still planning. Every sound, every shadow could be important. She thought about the rancher again, the quiet man who had observed without speaking. There was a calmness in him that she had not seen in anyone else in the town. He did not act rashly, but she sensed that he could act decisively if needed. Perhaps he understood something that others did not. Perhaps he would make a choice that could change her fate. She did not trust him completely, but she allowed herself a small hope. Survival sometimes required recognizing those rare opportunities. The woman closed her eyes briefly, letting the cold seep into her bones while her mind worked through possibilities. She had survived years of hardship, loss, and danger. She had faced hunger, fear, and the constant threat of violence. She had learned to move silently, to watch, and to wait. She would survive this situation too, even if it meant waiting for someone else to act, someone who might understand the value of her life. Outside, the town settled into the quiet of night. The snow fell lightly, covering streets and rooftops in a soft white layer. The woman remained hidden, patient and alert. Her mind focused on survival and observation. She could feel the weight of the coming decisions pressing down, the uncertainty of her fate, and the small spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, someone would stand for her when no one else would. She did not know what the next day would bring, but she knew that she would face it with the same careful determination that had kept her alive for so long. The morning arrived with a pale gray light that barely touched the frozen streets. Snow had melted slightly overnight, leaving patches of ice that made every step uncertain. The woman moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the town from shadow to shadow. She had learned much since arriving. The routines of the townspeople, the habits of the officials, the patterns of movement that could warn her of danger. She had also noticed the rancher, the quiet man at the edge of the square. He had watched her before, silently and carefully. Today she could sense something different in his presence, though she could not yet explain why. The town square filled with activity as merchants set up their stalls. Children ran past, their laughter sharp against the cold morning air. Officials gathered near the hall, their voices low but purposeful, and the woman crouched behind a stack of crates, hidden from view. She could hear them discussing her, debating her fate as though she were a problem, not a person. "We can't leave her here," one said. "It's too dangerous. Someone must take responsibility." The words cut through the air, but she remained calm. She had prepared for this moment. Observation and patience had always been her allies, and now they would guide her next moves. The rancher appeared near the edge of the square as he had the previous day, but today he moved with more purpose. He did not approach the officials directly, nor did he call out to anyone. Instead, he walked slowly, his eyes taking in the scene with quiet intensity. The woman noticed the subtle shift in him. He seemed ready to act. She did not trust him fully, yet she understood that this was a rare moment where survival might require risk. She could only wait and watch, as she had done so many times before. The officials began to prepare papers, pulling out books and legal documents that could decide her future. They spoke in hushed tones about custody, relocation, and responsibility. The woman understood that the law had no concern for her wishes. She had become a subject of debate, a figure whose life could be controlled with a signature or a word. Her heart tightened, but she stayed silent and still, keeping herself hidden. Fear was natural, but panic could be fatal. She relied on her mind, her observation, and the instincts that had kept her alive. The rancher approached one of the officials, standing slightly apart, his eyes calm and steady. He did not speak immediately, but his presence shifted the energy of the square. Officials noticed him, some frowning, others pausing their work. A pan ever revive dead. He looked at the papers, then at the woman, and finally back at the officials. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, carrying authority without aggression. "I will take responsibility for her," he said. The words surprised everyone. A hush fell over the group. Responsibility in this town was serious. Few accepted it without expectation, and it usually meant obligation, labor, and social risk. Yet he stood calmly, accepting it without hesitation. The woman's heart raced. She could hardly believe what she had just heard. The rancher was stepping forward, offering a path she had long feared would never come. She did not know his reasons, and she could not yet trust him completely. But for the first time since arriving, she saw a chance for freedom, a moment where she could leave the shadows behind. She remained hidden, cautious, knowing that the next moves would be critical. Survival depended not only on observation but also on timing and judgment. Officials reacted immediately. Some questioned his authority. "You cannot simply claim her," one said sharply. "The law requires proper procedures." The rancher remained calm, holding his ground. He spoke of legal guardianship, of responsibility for her care, and of the duty to protect life over paperwork. His argument was simple, direct, and difficult to oppose. The officials debated, but none could find a strong objection. He had presented a choice that the law recognized, and he had accepted the burden openly. The woman watched from her hiding place, feeling a mix of fear and hope. This man had changed her life in a single moment. As the discussion continued, she observed the rancher closely. He did not smile, he did not boast, and he did not seek attention. He simply stated his willingness to take responsibility and waited for the authorities to respond. There was something in his manner that suggested he understood the gravity of his words. He did not act for praise or gain. He acted because it was the right thing to do, a rare quality in a town often driven by fear, greed, and convenience. The woman felt a small spark of trust, fragile but real. Perhaps she had found an ally in the most unexpected place. The officials reluctantly accepted the arrangement, finalizing their decision on paper. The woman still remained behind her hiding spot, but she understood that the danger had passed for now. She could step forward, though cautiously, knowing that her life was no longer entirely at the mercy of strangers. She watched the rancher turn and glance briefly in her direction. There was no flourish, no gesture, only a quiet acknowledgement that he had acted for her benefit. She did not know how he had come to this decision, but she understood that it had changed her fate. When the officials departed, the rancher approached the woman carefully. His steps were deliberate, slow, and measured. She did not move immediately, keeping her distance, wary of any sudden motion. He stopped a few feet away and nodded slightly, a silent signal that he would not force her. Then, in a low, gentle voice, he said, "It is time. You can come with me." The words were simple, without ceremony or emotion, yet they carried more meaning than anything she had heard in months. She considered them carefully, weighing trust against caution, hope against fear. Finally, after a long moment, she stepped forward. Her movements were careful and controlled, a habit developed over years of survival. The rancher did not reach out, did not attempt to control her. He simply walked beside her, matching her pace, guiding her subtly without force. She noticed the quiet confidence in him, the way he seemed to understand without speaking, and she allowed herself to feel a small sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, someone had acted to protect her rather than threaten her. It was a fragile, new feeling, and she clung to it cautiously. As they walked toward his ranch at the edge of the settlement, the woman observed the town one last time. The streets, the officials, the people moving through their routines, all of it felt distant, almost unreal. Her life had been controlled by forces she could not influence for so long, and now, in a single act, the rancher had offered her a measure of freedom. She did not yet know what the future would hold, nor did she fully understand the man who had acted on her behalf. But she understood that she had a choice. for the first time in many years. The rancher led her along a narrow path through the outskirts, where the snow was thicker and the wind sharper. He did not speak unless necessary, and even then his words were measured and clear. He carried a calmness that contrasted sharply with the tension of the town, a quiet presence that made the woman feel less alone in a world that had long ignored her. She moved beside him with a mixture of caution and curiosity, aware that this moment marked a turning point in her life. The shadows of fear had not vanished entirely, but they were no longer the only forces shaping her path. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. The buildings were sturdy, built to withstand the harsh winters and rough winds. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, carrying the scent of wood and warmth. The rancher gestured toward the door, a simple motion without ceremony, indicating that she could enter. She hesitated briefly, then stepped inside, feeling the warmth envelop her like a shield against the cold and the fear she had carried for so long. Inside, the rancher moved with the same quiet efficiency she had observed all day. He showed her a small room prepared for her, simple but clean, with a bed and a few personal touches that suggested care and consideration. There were no questions about her past, no judgments about her presence. He had acted to protect her freedom, and now he gave her space to decide what to do with it. The woman sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the day slowly lift, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. For the first time, she had a moment to breathe. The rancher did not force conversation, but he offered food and warmth, allowing her to settle without pressure. She noticed his quiet attention to detail, the way he anticipated needs without intruding, the patience he showed in letting her move at her own pace. This was not kindness in words, but in action, and it carried a weight far greater than any spoken promise. She felt a fragile trust beginning to grow, tempered by years of caution and experience. She was not free from fear, but she was no longer entirely alone. As night fell over the ranch, the woman lay on the bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, the crackle of the fire, the occasional creak of timber, the distant wind moving through the trees. She thought of the town, of the officials, of the choices that had been made on her behalf. She thought of the rancher, the quiet man who had acted without demand or expectation, who had offered her a measure of freedom in a world that had tried to take it away. And for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to feel hope, cautious but real, that her life might take a new path from this day forward. The first days at the ranch were quiet, almost too quiet for the woman's restless mind. She had expected danger at every turn, yet the ranch offered only routine, work, and a strange calm order that felt unfamiliar. The rancher moved with quiet purpose, tending to the animals, the fences, and the buildings, always aware, always careful. He spoke little, only when necessary, but his actions said more than words ever could. She watched him, studied him, and slowly began to understand the rhythm of his life. In doing so, she began to find a rhythm of her own. At first, she kept to herself, spending her time in the small room assigned to her, or wandering carefully around the yard. The animals watched her with curiosity, the horses sniffing at her hands, the cattle glancing with mild interest. The rancher allowed her space, giving her chores to learn, not as punishment, but as a way to help her find purpose in this new place. She fed the animals, gathered firewood, and cleaned the small areas of the ranch she could manage. Each task, simple though it was, gave her a sense of control she had not felt in months. Control was a fragile thing, and she cherished it. The woman noticed the rancher's quiet habits. He rose early, long before the sun, and worked tirelessly until dusk. His movements were deliberate, his attention to detail remarkable. Yet he never demanded more than she could give. He seemed to understand her limits, and though he did not speak of it, she could feel the respect in his actions. Trust, she realized, was not built in words alone. It was built in patience, in observation, and in small acts of consideration repeated over time. Slowly she allowed herself to observe him as a man, not just a stranger who had changed her fate. Mealtimes were the first real challenge. The woman was unused to shared space, to the presence of someone who expected nothing but attention to the task at hand. She ate quietly, avoiding conversation, and the rancher respected her silence. At first he did not speak to her at all during meals, focusing on his own food. She watched him carefully, noting the ease with which he moved, the way he carried himself, and the calm expression that rarely changed. Over time, she began to answer small questions he asked, offering brief replies, testing the waters of trust. Each small interaction was an exercise in patience for both of them. The weather remained harsh, snow fell in thick layers, and the cold seemed unending. The woman had learned long ago how to survive in such conditions, but the rancher's preparations made her life easier. There were warm blankets, food stores, and shelter that was both practical and comfortable. Yet comfort did not remove the fear she carried. She had been alone for too long, had seen too much loss, and had learned to expect betrayal at every turn. She did not trust easily, and trust was not given quickly here, even with the man who had saved her from the town. Days turned into weeks, and she began to understand the rhythm of ranch life. There were chores to do at sunrise, animals to feed, fences to repair, and fires to keep burning. Where the work was hard, but it had a grounding effect, keeping her mind focused on tasks rather than fears. She noticed the rancher's methodical approach, how he organized tools, how he planned the day, how he cared for the animals. He did not force her into these routines, but he encouraged her participation, making her feel like a partner rather than a servant. The small victories of mastering a new skill gave her confidence and a sense of belonging she had not known in years. Evenings brought quiet reflection. She would sit by the fire in her small room, listening to the wind against the walls, thinking of the town, the officials, and the decisions that had led her here. She thought of the rancher, the quiet man who had changed her life with a single decision. There was something steady about him, a reliability she had longed for but never found. She could not yet call it trust, but it was a beginning. She allowed herself to notice it, to acknowledge it, and to consider the possibility of safety in his presence. One day, a small incident tested the boundaries of trust. A horse had escaped from the corral, running across the snowy fields toward the edge of the property. The woman froze at first, unsure whether to act. The rancher did not panic. He moved with calm efficiency, guiding the animals and securing the gates. He did not shout at her for hesitation, but showed her how to handle the situation, step by step, without blame. She followed his instructions, her confidence growing as the horse returned safely to the corral. The incident was small, yet it marked a turning point. She began to see that mistakes here were met with guidance, not punishment, and that trust could be learned through actions rather than promises. As the days continued, small conversations began to form. The rancher asked questions, simple ones at first, about her past and her experiences, never pushing, never demanding. She answered cautiously, offering fragments of her story, careful not to reveal too much too soon. He listened, not judging, not reacting harshly, and the silence that followed his questions felt safe rather than threatening. These moments were precious, as she had not spoken freely in months. The act of sharing, even minimally, was a step toward healing, and she began to recognize it as part of her survival. Winter storms came and went, each bringing its own challenges. Snow piled high against the fences. Winds howled across the plains, and temperatures dropped below freezing. The rancher continued his work without complaint, and she learned from his patience and skill. Together they repaired fences, cleared paths, and ensured the animals were fed and safe. The work was grueling, but it also built a quiet partnership. Neither spoke much, yet their actions began to communicate understanding, respect, and shared responsibility. Words were not needed when the rhythm of life demanded cooperation. In the quiet moments, the woman reflected on her past, on the years of wandering and survival. She had lived through loss, fear, and solitude, yet she had endured. Now, in this place, she faced a different challenge, learning to live alongside someone she had barely met, someone who had changed her fate, yet remained a mystery. She struggled with the tension between independence and reliance, between caution and trust. Every small step she took toward trust was measured, deliberate, and intentional. The rancher, for his part, remained patient. He did not pressure her to speak or act beyond her comfort. He recognized her need for space and control, understanding that freedom was not just a matter of safety, but of choice. His silence was not neglect, it was respect. In these moments, she began to feel something she had not felt in a long time, a sense of being seen as a person, rather than a problem to solve. It was fragile, delicate, yet it grew steadily with each passing day. By the end of the month, a quiet routine had formed. She rose early, worked alongside him during the day, and spent evenings reflecting by the fire. They spoke when necessary, shared meals without pressure, and cared for the animals together. Trust, though not complete, had begun to take root. She could see in his actions that he valued her presence not as a duty, but as a choice, and this realization was both startling and comforting. The rancher had given her more than shelter. He had given her space to reclaim her life, to learn that freedom could exist beyond fear. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned orange and pink, she stepped outside, feeling the cold wind on her face. The rancher was repairing a fence nearby, his movements steady and precise. She watched him for a moment, then moved closer, carrying a small bundle of wood for the fire. He nodded in acknowledgement, and for the first time she felt the simple connection of shared work, of two people surviving and living together without words needing to explain everything. It was a beginning, quiet but real, and it marked the slow, steady growth of trust between them. That night, as she lay in her bed, the warmth of the fire casting gentle light across the room, she thought about the life she had left behind, the town, the officials, and the paths that had led her here. She also thought about the rancher, the quiet man who had changed her fate and offered her a place in his world. Slowly, cautiously, she began to understand that survival was no longer just about hiding and enduring. It was also about accepting help, learning to trust, and discovering that freedom could exist even in unexpected places. The winter continued, harsh and unyielding, yet within the walls of the ranch, life began to take on a rhythm. The woman worked, observed, learned, and adapted. She had faced fear and uncertainty before, but now she faced something different. The challenge of rebuilding a life alongside someone who had become her protector, her ally, and, in small ways, her companion. The trust that grew between them was quiet, unspoken, yet it held the promise of something more, a life where fear no longer ruled every step and where she could begin to find a place to belong. Winter was slowly losing its grip on the land. The days grew longer, the sun climbed higher, and the snow began to melt in patches across the fields. The ranch, once a frozen, quiet place, now carried the steady rhythm of life renewed. The woman had grown accustomed to this new routine. She no longer moved, only out of caution, She moved with purpose, confidence, and the quiet sense that she belonged somewhere. The rancher, too, remained a steady presence, his calm watchfulness a constant in the changing seasons. Together, though in silence most of the time, they had formed a life that balanced work, patience, and understanding. The woman had learned much over the weeks. She knew the animals as if they were old friends, could tend the fields and fences with skill, and even anticipate the needs of the ranch before the rancher mentioned them. She no longer felt like a guest in someone else's life. Instead, she was a part of it, though she moved cautiously, aware that trust had to be maintained through action rather than words alone. The rancher never pushed her. He expected work, yes, but he also respected the boundaries she had carefully constructed over years of survival. That respect meant more to her than she could easily express. One morning, a visitor arrived unexpectedly. A man from the town, an official, came to check on the arrangements made weeks before. The woman felt her chest tighten. She had feared this moment, the moment when the law would intrude, questioning the rancher's decisions, questioning her presence. But the rancher met the man at the gate with calm authority. He spoke firmly, explaining that he had accepted responsibility for her and was providing shelter, care, and guidance according to the law. The official listened, questioned briefly, then nodded reluctantly, satisfied that the woman was safe. She watched from the porch, feeling a strange mix of relief and pride. She had survived yet another test, not by fleeing, but by standing quietly in the presence of the one person who had acted to protect her. The days passed with a new sense of normalcy. The woman no longer had to hide or fear the decisions of strangers. She could walk through the ranch without constant vigilance, tending to chores with confidence. The rancher remained nearby, guiding silently when necessary, but leaving her freedom intact. Trust had grown between them, slowly and carefully, built on shared work and quiet respect. She began to speak more, sharing small details about her past, fragments of stories from her childhood, memories of her people. The rancher listened, rarely interrupting, his presence steady and comforting. In those moments, she realized that safety was not only physical, but also emotional. She was allowed to exist fully, without fear or judgment. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the frozen fields, the woman found herself alone with the rancher, helping to repair a fence that had been weakened by snow. She worked efficiently, her hands steady, and for a moment, they both paused to look over the land. She felt a quiet contentment, a feeling she had not known in years. The rancher spoke then, softly, not commanding, not questioning, but simply stating, "You've learned quickly." It was the first time he had acknowledged her directly, and the warmth in his voice carried more meaning than any formal words could. She nodded, offering a small smile, realizing that recognition could be as powerful as protection. As the weeks passed, the woman's confidence grew. She began to take initiative, caring for the animals without prompting, preparing meals, and learning to manage small tasks that were once overwhelming. She found a rhythm in the work, a sense of purpose that replaced the fear and uncertainty she had carried for so long. The rancher observed quietly, intervening only when necessary, and she appreciated the space he gave her to grow. It was a partnership forged in patience, respect, and shared responsibility, and it allowed her to discover strength she had forgotten she possessed. One evening, the woman stood at the edge of the ranch, looking out over the plains that stretched beyond the fences. The sky was painted with the colors of sunset, orange and pink blending into purple, and the air was filled with the quiet sounds of life returning to the land. She thought of the years she had spent wandering, surviving alone, and the countless times she had feared for her life. And yet, she realized that she had endured, not only through skill but through resilience, patience, and the rare kindness of one man who had chosen to act when others would not. A sense of gratitude and quiet joy settled in her chest. The rancher joined her silently, carrying a small bundle of firewood. He placed it near the edge of the porch and looked out at the same horizon. For a moment neither spoke, the silence comfortable rather than tense. The woman realized that this shared silence was a form of trust in itself. Words were not necessary to convey understanding, respect, or companionship. They had built a life together in actions, routines, and quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence. The past, with all its fear and uncertainty, had not disappeared, but it no longer defined her. One day a storm approached, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. The woman moved quickly to secure the animals and reinforce the shelter. The rancher worked alongside her, efficient and calm, his presence reassuring rather than commanding. The storm tested them, challenging their preparations and resilience, yet they managed it together. By evening, the wind had passed, leaving the ranch intact, the animals safe, and the woman feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. She realized that she was no longer merely surviving. She was thriving, learning to navigate life alongside someone she trusted and respected. As the months moved toward spring, the ranch took on a renewed sense of life. Crops began to grow, the animals were strong, and the routines of daily work became second nature. The woman's skills and confidence had grown immensely, and she began to feel a sense of ownership over her life and her choices. She no longer felt like a victim of circumstance. The rancher had given her safety and freedom, yes, but she had also claimed her place in the world through action, diligence, and courage. Trust had been built, not granted, and it was stronger for it. The woman began to reflect on her journey. She thought of the years of fear, the long nights of hiding, and the constant uncertainty that had shaped her early life. She remembered the town where she had been at the mercy of officials, the moments of despair and the constant vigilance that had kept her alive. And yet she also remembered the turning point, the day the rancher had stepped forward, offering her a measure of freedom she had not believed possible. That act of courage had altered the course of her life, and she understood that her survival had depended as much on his choices as on her own skills and resilience. One afternoon she sat by the fire in her small room, writing on scraps of paper she had saved. She recorded memories, thoughts, and plans for the future. Writing was a new form of expression, a way to process her experiences and to assert control over her narrative. She did not share the papers yet, keeping them private, but the act of writing was empowering. It reminded her that she was not just surviving, she was reclaiming her voice, her identity, and her life. Each word was a small victory, a step toward healing from the long years of uncertainty. The rancher noticed her growing confidence but did not intrude. He allowed her space to develop, only offering guidance when she sought it. In quiet ways, he showed her respect, leaving her room prepared, providing tools for her work, and never questioning her decisions unnecessarily. The woman recognized these acts as gestures of trust and partnership. She had learned that true freedom was not simply the absence of danger, but the presence of choice, support, and respect. The rancher had given her the conditions for that freedom, and she had embraced it fully. As spring arrived, the land blossomed with new life. Grass grew green, trees budded, and animals thrived. The woman felt a renewed sense of possibility. She walked the fields, tending to the animals, repairing fences, and preparing the land for the season ahead. Each task brought satisfaction and a quiet pride she had not known in years. She had faced loss, fear, and uncertainty, yet she had endured. Now she could live, not just survive. The freedom she had longed for was no longer a distant hope. It was her reality. The rancher stood beside her as they surveyed the fields, his calm presence a reminder that she was not alone. They spoke little, yet communication flowed through shared work, quiet gestures, and mutual respect. She realized that life could be rebuilt, even after hardship, and that trust and patience could create something lasting. The past remained part of her, but it no longer dictated her every step. She had been given a chance to reclaim her life, and she had done so with courage, resilience, and careful choice. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, the woman and the rancher stood together watching over the land. The ranch was no longer just a place of shelter. It had become home. She had survived unimaginable hardship and had learned that freedom was both fragile and precious. It was not something granted lightly, nor could it be taken for granted. It was earned through patience, courage, and trust. And now, at last, she felt that she had earned it. The woman finally understood something essential. Her life was her own. The past, with all its hardships, had shaped her, but it no longer controlled her. The rancher's silent guidance, his patient presence, and his respect for her choices had given her the opportunity to reclaim herself. She stood tall, looking out across the fields, and felt a quiet sense of triumph. She was no longer just surviving, she was living. She was free, and in that freedom she found not only safety, but the possibility of hope, resilience, and a life rebuilt on her own terms.